Hello and welcome everyone. This is Taco Movie Talks. I'm here with Matt. We had a very interesting discussion just last weekend. We were talking Park Chan Wook and Bong Hoo Jo or Bong Joon Jun Ho. And in that discussion, we got to talking about more art house type films, and Luis Buñuel's name came up, which inevitably sparked today's discussion, which is two Buñuel movies, That Obscure Object of Desire and Los Olvidados slash, or in English rather, The Young and the Damned. Matt, this was your recommendation, and as I was saying before we started recording, I'm really, really happy you recommended Buñuel, and it leads me to the first question, which is, how were you introduced to Buñuel?
I was actually just thinking about how to answer that because I figured you were going to ask it, and I can't quite remember. So, like, my best guess would be I heard about the that other movie we were discussing last weekend, Unshine Andalo, the one that's very experimental.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I watched that, and I wasn't like, wow, this is the best thing I've ever seen, but it was more like I've never really seen anything like this. This is really cool. Like, how are they doing this? How are they making these images appear the way they do? And so I think after that, I started watching more of his movies. And I remember the one I really connected with most, my first watch was Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. I thought it was really funny. And it was also really interesting, the different like surrealist aspects of that movie. And after that, I just started going through his filmography.
So, that kind of leads me to two separate questions that I kind of want to follow up with you on. Well, not a question, one kind of just comment based on the short film that you were speaking about, which is 16 minutes long, can be watched on YouTube, and was a collaboration between Buñuel and the famous artist Salvador Dali. And it is very, very experimental, like you said, and also it is mind blowing, like you said, wondering how did they do some of this stuff because of the time in which it released. I believe it was released and aired in the late 1920s, which makes a lot of what they do all the more impressive. Some of the effects, like the ants in the hand, were that to me was the most impressive part, bar none. And it's also quite an infamous short film because of the scene that happens within the first minute of the film, which actually shows footage of a goat's eye being cut open by a straight razor, which is very visceral, to start any short film with. And I kind of want to get your comment on that, but first I want to ask you, because this was a burning question before we started recording, in regards to the bourgeoisie movie that Buñuel has, and you described it as this very cutting satire, and not having seen very much satirical commentary type movies, the main one that I had seen and enjoyed greatly was Doctor Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick. I guess, how does it kind of compare to that? And secondly, is the political satire, is it about American politics, Spanish politics, Mexican politics, from what you remember, I guess?
Yeah, so from what I remember, it's definitely a satire on like European politics. The reason I think we might connect better with um Stanley Kubrick's satirical movie you mentioned is that it was much more about American politics at the time, and even though we don't live in that time period, we still learn a lot about it. This Discreet Charm was more about like upper class, and this is just from my memory, so I may get some of this wrong, but it was about like upper class European people, maybe from like wealthier families, the kind of ruling people that had big mansions, estates in Europe with like servers, butlers, maids, and that movie, it just like I remember thinking it was funny, and for me, like obviously being pretty disconnected from 1970s European politics, that means I think it's much more universal than you would think, and I think that any of us could probably enjoy that movie. But there's like a lot of surrealist parts of that. Like I remember there's this one scene that I remember more than any other scene where this he's going to talk to this guy in this room, and he opens this cabinet or this drawer, and then this guy is like laying in this coffin in the drawer and just gets out of it. Like that's like the surrealist part that I really like. Like it's very creative and unique, and there's really like no other movies I've seen quite like them.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good point in that surrealism has been used in multiple genres. David Lynch is maybe the most popular example of surrealism being used in a horror sense. But Bunuel is able to use it quite effectively, I would say, in these two movies, which are much more dramatic, I would say, without as much of a horror tinge to them. But to your point, from the sounds of it, and it seems quite obvious that it would lend itself to comedy, is that it can be utilized in comedy and actually seems kind of like a good marriage of the two, because surrealism is very close to absurdism, which I think has become very popular in some like alternative comedy shows and movies alike. So it does sound like a good marriage of surrealism and satire, that Bunuel did with that movie.
Yeah, yeah. His what I like a quick comment about his movies. I think his movies in general changed the way people thought about and made movies. Like especially the first film we mentioned. I'm gonna butcher it again, but like Unshine, Andalo. That like when I think of movies that seem more like dreams and they're very illogical, like the two directors I think of are Buñuel and David Lynch.
Yeah, and I was kind of talking to you that I was very surprised that Bunuel was the guy who did it first. And I would have to think Lynch was greatly, greatly influenced by Bunuel.
Yes, yes. I think I think both of them were trying to achieve in my opinion, something like completely dreamlike. Like if you try and analyze the 1920s Unshine film, that like I feel like you can't really say what's happening or like trying to describe what's going on. It's not even really just possible at all. You just kind of have to watch it. It's more like describing like a surrealist work of art. It's kind of the same. Like I feel like his films are very close, maybe the closest a movie could have to like a painting than uh like any other type of film we've really discussed on here.
And his short film, The Unshine Andalo, which again I will butcher as well, but that is his first work from what I saw looking at his profile on They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? Which it gives really nice biographies of different directors for anyone listening to this who kind of wants to understand what a director is all about, maybe before going and watching their film. That is the distillation, I would say, of extreme surreal cinema, and is likely to be one of the first examples of that being done, I would think. And it's very, very interesting to see how this side that we saw from Bunuel is injected into the two films that we discussed, because it's done very differently when you compare and contrast that obscure object of desire, where it's, I think, much more pronounced, and The Young and the Damned, where it's kind of injected into just short segments of the film. And we can definitely talk about that, because maybe there was more surrealist moments that I missed in The Young and the Damned, but it seems much more like just sprinkled throughout the entirety of that obscure object of desire. But it's really unique to kind of see this unique aspect of him as a director kind of used throughout his movies, because when you watch a David Lynch movie, obviously no two films are exactly the same, but it's something that is like almost ever present in his films, and they kind of present themselves similarly in that everything is kind of through that lens, whereas with Bunuel, he utilizes it very different from film to film. Would you agree with that, Matt? What is your kind of take on how much he sprinkles into each movie, and kind of, taking his foot off the gas when it comes to surrealism in his films, specifically the two that we're going to cover today?
I feel like with David Lynch, I haven't seen that movie, The Straight Story, but I've heard that one is very different than his other ones. But I feel like besides that movie, pretty much every David Lynch film I've seen has a very similar like tone to it. Like you can
Mm.
say that you can watch the movie and you can be like, this is definitely a David Lynch movie for what's happening here. I think the same can be said for Bunuel, but I think the difference in what I found watching him is like The Young and the Damned. I agree with what you were saying about that. It's very like the surrealist aspect is much more subtle. I feel like it's in there in different segments of the movie, like a lot of times when he's talking, the main character is like fighting with his mom and stuff like that is happening. It kind of pops in a little, but I feel like maybe he develops it more as his career went on, or maybe it's him kind of finding his style, because I think of like the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. I know that was early 70s. I know Obscure Object of Desire was more in the late 70s. And The Phantom of Liberty is another movie that I remember being even more kind of confusing and surrealist. And the other ones I could think of, like Exterminating Angel, Belle de Jour, they're all like much more heavy on it than The Young and the Damned. I feel like, and I was kind of saying this before we started, but I feel like, and I don't know this for sure, but The Young and the Damned might be a more personal movie to him, and maybe he didn't want to make it too uh like surrealist or too crazy or dreamlike. He wanted to, it seemed like he wanted to tell a more straightforward story, because there's like a definitive plot, here,
Mm.
like you could say there's definitely a plot in That Obscure Object of Desire, but it's, you kind of in the movie and you're like, what was the meaning of that? Whereas like Young and the Damned, you end it and you kind of get it, like the story is much more obvious, like the message is trying to tell.
I completely agree. And you made a really great comparison while we were kind of looking through Bunuel's filmography, trying to decide what we should discuss for this episode. And the comparison you made was that The Young and the Damned is reminiscent to you of Kids 1995, the Larry Clark movie written by Harmony Korine. And I love that comparison. And from that aspect, I love these two movies, The Young and the Damned and Kids, because that story is just really effective when done correctly. And I think both of the directors did it. It has, both films, a gritty, realistic film. And to your point, that is hard to interject surrealism whilst trying to also, marry yourself to realism. And I think because, like you said, how personal the story was, that was, something that he had to get creative, and how he kind of did it. When I say did it, I mean inject the surrealism into the film. And I like the way that he did do it, and I felt like it was very poignant when he did it, where he was kind of able to really put in these big symbolic scenes while having a very dark, gritty, and realistic movie that gets its point across throughout the majority of the other scenes. So it was really unique to see. And I guess I want to ask you, between these two movies, that kind of the usage of surrealism, what did you like more? Just in terms of the amount of surrealism that was used, do you feel like there is some effectiveness to using it more intensely but picking your spots, or have it kind of as a steady kind of throughout the entire movie?
That's a good question. Personally, I I would say, like, for me personally, I like when it's kind of the whole thing is like surrealist, just because like the way I remember and appreciate movies a lot of the time is because of the images. And usually like I'm thinking of Discreet Charm, of the Bourgeoisie, and certain moments in Obscure Object of Desire, when things are very like basically they seem off, or something's not right, or it doesn't seem, something not based in reality is like coming into this movie, and it like jumps out at you. I like that more. But like what you were saying, it's hard to get a like impactful, realistic story like a kid's type of movie, or the Young and the Damned type movie, if there are these things happening that take you out of the realistic world. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think the point of movies like The Young and the Damned, and this other movie that I'm thinking of that's similar in ways, called Pashote. It's another one. A lot of like messed up coming of age films. They kind of have to like they're based in their time period. Like Kids is like the 90s New York City, like street kids. And if you all of a sudden start putting a bunch of fantasy elements in that, well, it totally changes the movie, for better or for worse. But I think if you're trying to stick on that realistic, this is how it was in this time, like with these sorts of young people, then I think that you gotta make the surrealist aspects a little more subtle.
I completely agree. Matt, I want to dive into. Well, let me ask you, which film would you like to cover first?
Let's do The Young and the Damned first. This is earlier one.
Okay. So this kind of covers, like you said, a coming of age story of a group of young boys near Mexico City, and ultimately, this poverty stricken neighborhood or kind of community has a great impact on the coming of age of this kind of young group, in which we see how the family unit is much different in poverty stricken areas, and how that can impact the life trajectory of the youth in that area. Very realistic, it feels, in how that can impact someone's young life. I really did love the grittiness to this movie. There's also something that I will say, which can oftentimes not be the case and impact a movie for the worst. There was a lot of younger actors and actresses, and I have to commend their performances because I thought they were very solid. And I'm sure, Matt, you've seen, like I have, sometimes when there's a child actor who doesn't quite nail their performance, that can kind of throw the whole um, recipe out of whack, for lack of a better term. But that was definitely not the case with this one, and everything felt very powerful because their performances were on point.
Yeah, I like thinking back on the movie, I didn't ever notice any one of the child actors like acting poorly in a way that takes me out of the movie. Like that's the one thing that usually happens. Like I can tell, or if someone's acting isn't up great or up to par, it very like makes me go, oh no, like this isn't gonna be good, because it kind of takes me out of the movie if I can tell they're acting. But
Mm-hmm.
these, all these actors, to me, they felt real, and I don't know the history, if these were actual actors or if these were non-actors that were actually from this area. I don't know the story, but I feel like that would be something interesting to know. But like, just from the way it's filmed and how they act and like what they look like and everything, they seem very realistic.
I agree. Um, and the major element of, there's kind of two storylines that cross. Um, I mean, there's multiple kind of side stories that branch off and then come back to the main storyline. But there is kind of a ringleader who is released from jail, who has a great impact on, I guess, who would be our main character. And then there's kind of a side character who ends up playing a major role as well. Someone who was kind of left in the town square, who they call, I think, Small Face or Little Eyes, um, whose father left him and then ends up staying with a blind man in town. Overall, it did feel like you said, almost like a memoir of sorts. Just the amount of detail that went into the lives of every character involved. It felt like it was someone recounting people that they actually knew growing up. So I feel like you hit the nail on the head, Matt, when you said this feels very personal to Bunuel.
Yeah, it does, because I mean, to tell a story like this, I feel like you have to know the locals, know what's been going on in the area. I feel like you've had to experience it. Like I couldn't go over to Mexico or any foreign country and really figure out what life is like for uh like teenagers or kids in the area. To make a good story out of that, I think you really have to be very familiar with how they're brought up, like what they like to do in their free time, what the issues of the town really are, because then you can show it. And then I think an interesting part is you just see a lot of other people chime in and say, no, this is, really what it was like back in 1950 in Mexico City.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too far away from the plot of this movie, but I feel like it's worth mentioning because this story, I think, shows how easily youth can be not maybe corrupted is the most accurate word, but kind of steered in the wrong direction, because it's not. It's a very violent turn, but it happens ever so subtly in this movie when you consider what Mexico is like now and how prevalent the cartel is. So, a life of crime is something that still very much exists in Mexico, and you would have to think that the recipe for that is very, very similar. And it almost leads you to see kind of how the inception of that could be created, because where there is poverty, people will look for opportunities where they can find them. And this film is a great illustration of that. I just find that to be very interesting, where it's like, that maybe the cartel wasn't really incepted yet in the 1950s, but 70 years later, you can see how a culture can evolve and how generation after generation will almost be completely molded by the poverty stricken areas from generation to generation.
Yeah, I don't think the cartels were around in 1950, as far as I know. But yeah, it's like you can see the violence was there, and that mentality, of when you're so poor that, the main character's mom is like having trouble kind of like keeping up with being able to feed them and keep up with the house and whatnot. Uh, it's it's that that whole like lifestyle and outlook just leads to a lot of violence, and it's it's a it's it's a sad movie. Like when I got done, I was like, man, this was a really sad movie, and it's obviously a lot of that is because of the plot. It's a pretty sad plot, but a lot of it, I really feel like he is trying to say, this is a product of the culture of this area, um, how kids are raised in the city, and I think more than anything else, he's showing what was probably going on everywhere at the time, like teenagers forming gangs. I mean, you see that same kind of thing in a lot of poverty-stricken area. People forming gangs and then violence happening. You see it all across the entire world, and I think maybe this is just his, way to show that this is what it's like in Mexico City, and it's just unfortunate how young everybody is too.
Yeah, that is one of the most striking elements from the get go, is that not only is there, like, the ringleader is pretty young himself, but he's dramatically older than a lot of the other kids in this pseudo gang, which is, it is kind of heartbreaking, because I would imagine if there was like a teenager who was willing to hang out with me, that would be something that would be very, like, not lucrative, but something that you would want to hang out with an older kid, if they would, you know, be willing to hang out with you as well. And I would think that they could be, really persuasive, and be able to get you to do crime a lot easier than maybe if one of your friends of the same age when you're really young suggested the same. But you brought up the mother of our main character, and I find her whole story and what her character is representative of to be one of the most interesting. But also, I think Bunuel did a great job of making every character very interesting. But I want to touch upon the mother, because I think it shows how vital a role the parents are in helping to try to keep your kids in check. Because I think that is something which is very formulaic to the corruption of youth, is not having a solid family unit. And you almost can't even blame her, because like you said, she's working multiple jobs just to be able to try to bring resources home for her family. And I say formulaic because it seems like the system that she is in right now is, there really is no clean solution, and there's a lot being asked of her, and I do think that that's ultra realistic, like you said, to what creates problems in everyday life even today.
Yeah, it's like it's very similar, you know, when you think of these areas that have a lot of violence and, you know, there's stuff like gang violence happens. A lot of it is like you were saying, you know, there's a lot of like single parent households and they're not only trying to provide for their kids, sometimes multiple kids on a salary that is like not even close to enough to be able to support that many people. Even it would even be tough supporting themselves on that a lot of the times. So, you know, you're thinking about this like as adults, you know, they're working all the time. They're really tired when they get home from work. And then they have to take care of like their kids, you know, and they have to feed their kids. They have to, like nowadays it's different, or you might have to pay for school. You know, I think that'd be different in this film, but just, you know, all the costs that come with having kids. And then like what are you supposed to do if you're working and they skip school or they're home or they're getting into trouble? You know, you don't really have a lot of time and energy to correct all that behavior or to uh, put them into activities where they're not, you know, falling in with people that are doing, you know, like drugs or or they're violent. So it's just like this situation that's created where it's and not only that, like these types of people in these areas usually don't have like access to birth control methods, or they wouldn't have enough money for abortion a lot of the time. So you just have like all these problems like culminate into uh it ends up that you have all these kids that are just kind of running around free and they don't really have much parenting. And you know, I think it's good that for kids to have freedom, but I think that, you know, when there's a problem when they start to hang out with people like the character in this, what's his name, Jabert, the kind of psychopathic violent guy.
I believe so. I was
Yeah,
trying to remember his name earlier and I couldn't think of it.
when you know that's like people like him are going to start taking advantage of these younger kids that don't really have any guidance, and you see that happen in this movie. So yeah, it's just like a whole like culture and lifestyle that's created by all these circumstances and factors, and it leads to, you know, this movie basically.
Yeah, and so it's El Hebo, I believe, is because the J is pronounced like an H. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I think so.
One kind of like um, startling statistic that I heard, I haven't looked it up myself, but it just kind of came into my mind, is the negative, like ultra negative life paths that are statistically much more likely to occur in specifically single mother households. I believe murder, to have a son specifically who becomes a murderer is 50% more likely. To have a son that connect or that commits sexual assault is much more likely in single mother households. And when you kind of break that down, the family dynamic, I don't think it's indicting mothers whatsoever. I think if you look specifically at the trials and tribulations that puts a family unit in, whenever they only have a single source of income from a mother, It just seems like it's a very bad situation for any family to be in, and that plays out, I think, perfectly in this film. I also think that they explore the dynamic of once someone has been incarcerated, as El Habo has been, and you come out, your value system, I think, is generally changed, until maybe you can adjust back to the societal norms. But toughness, violence are kind of the currency that runs supreme when in incarceration. And we get to see how that plays out. Because if you were to be the leader, you have to be the most aggressive and the most violent. And in a normal society, that obviously doesn't mesh well with what is valued.
Yeah, I think like when I think of certain like places like prison, for example, like you think of a society or an area where there isn't really a lot of like structure in terms of like I don't it's hard to explain, but just like take like a the prison system where you don't really there's no way to like get ahead of anyone else except being the biggest, strongest, most violent or most willing to be violent if needed to. Like when it comes down to like primitive type things, like you strip away like government, money, like you take away like a currency system. Like, well, what's left of people is like similar, is going to be like similar to other animals like we think of. It's like, okay, well, how you have power over others is like completely based on your like physical strength, like your physical raw strength and your willingness to like take extreme risks and uh like also your willingness to just screw other people over. Like whoever can basically like whoever ends up be like screwing other people over the most like ends up ahead. It's just like the sad reality of like a culture or a place that you live where there's not really a way to get ahead of others or to come out on top without being like manipulative or violent. And so like in cultures like that or places like that where that develops, I think like you see that kind of thing play out in this movie.
Yeah, exactly. And it is so strange when you think about it, Matt, that it's generally behaviors that are very likely to send you back to prison, that I it's not promoted, but it's like the only way to survive in prison. Don't you think it's almost, and I'm not being conspiratorial in that like this is propagated or planned by anyone, but it is weird how cyclical those systems can be.
Yeah, that's you know what you hear people talking about all the time because it's like you go in and within the prison system, like the way the social aspect of this prison system works is like you have to show people that one, you're gonna respect them, and two, that you deserve to be respected by them. So like if someone comes up to you and starts picking a fight, like and you back down and you're like, no, I don't want to fight, and this guy is also like 4 inches taller than you and like 50 pounds heavier than you, even though you know you're gonna lose, like within the prison culture, like you have to fight, like you have to take that risk and be brave in order to gain respect from the other inmates. But then at the same time, by doing that, by gaining that respect, and in all honesty, by like you have to do that to survive in prison. Like you're probably gonna have to fight if you're in a like high level prison with a bunch of people who have like murdered others.
Mhm.
Like cuz that's like the way they see you is either you're a fighter and they'll respect you or you're not and they're going to walk all over you and they're going to manipulate you. So it's I forget now. I kind of got lost about what my point was going to be saying all that, but I think I was just trying to say that that kind of that whole respect and physical fighting thing is like the dominant. That's like the hierarchy. Like the person at the top is going to be like the 6'6" guy who's 250 pounds, and everyone knows he's killed a couple people. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. So like if you fight back within that system, which you're supposed to do, in terms of the other inmates, like that's how they're going to respect you. The prison system itself, they're going to throw you, or they're going to give you more time for that. Or if you end up fighting someone and you accidentally kill them, but it really wasn't self-defense, well, now you have another murder charge and you're stuck in there for longer. So it's like this very like perpetuating type thing. And then I know I'm really getting into the present thing here, but another thing is like if you're in and you're going in there as a violent person, or you're going in there as a drug user, you're going to see more violence and more drug use in prison than you were outside. So it's like just going to make it worse for you. So you're probably going to end up back in prison when you get out. It's like people have this like PTSD when they get out, that they think they're going to be attacked all the time. And so I guess relating that to the movie, it's like how do you also get out of this society? Like how do you make it out of this place?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you see in El Habo how that influences him, but then he in turn influences those around him. So he creates a more chaotic, a more aggressive culture for these very young kind of group of kids to try to adapt to. That becomes their new style of life. He's the oldest kid amongst them, so that is the person that I think it would be natural to look up to in a sort of way. Because a lot of them don't actually have father figures around, so El Habo becomes a ill-fated father figure for a lot of them, and that's the person they have to look up to. Another really interesting character that I kind of wanted to touch upon, because I think he completes a sort of trilogy of sorts of how cyclical this type of society can be, where poverty can be kind of like a sinkhole of sorts. And that is the blind man performer, because he has multiple aspects about him that I find to be very interesting when considering the kind of scene that he is put in, and that he seems to want to help the little boy who was kind of deserted by his father, but in a kind of climactic kind of scenario between the two, you can see that he is very doubting of this new generation and very pessimistic as to their impact on the community at large. And he kind of feels like they are the people to blame for all the wrongs that are going on in the community, which I find to be very interesting, because I do think that that can be an added element to why sometimes communities can take a turn for the worse, because rather than having elders try to promote beneficial change for the youth, they can just kind of point the finger at them and blame them for what's going wrong, which kind of creates another divide. Rather than mentoring them, they can be aggressive and violent as well towards them. And another kind of interesting dynamic with that character is someone who is, and I want to say this carefully, someone who is disadvantaged, rather than be uplifted by the community around them because they need that, they can be the kind of an easy target for crime, which we see play out in this film. I thought that character was definitely needed in this film, and I think he kind of outlined a lot of crucial points that needed to be said about that community in the movie.
Yeah, I was, when I was watching it, I was interested in what you would say about his that character because I couldn't quite put my finger on what I thought his role was, except um I guess he does kind of just represent like what would be like the elder or the OG as some people would call it, like the guy who has been around for a long time. He seems to know when they're about to rob him before they even do it, even though he's blind. Um, so it's like, he's been around the block. He knows kind of what's going on, but like you were saying, he just kind of doesn't really do much himself to change it. It's just kind of like I think the last time we see him is when he thinks they took that gold or money or whatever he had, and he realizes they didn't, and he's like extremely happy because he's like holding it in his hand, like, oh, thank God they didn't take this. So it's kind of like he he could have been a character that maybe try to let leave an impact or tell them a story of why they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, but instead he's also just like looking out for himself, like.
Mm.
And I think you can't fully blame it on him either, because that's just everyone in that town seems like they're just looking out for themselves, and it's like a dog eat dog world. Like, you can't, there's not a lot of good and like progress that happens.
Yeah, exactly. And it is, it seems very natural for someone in his position who has been taken advantage of, um and not having a way to really defend themselves, to be so just fiercely independent and only looking out for themselves because they feel like they need to be on their defense all the time. Um, there's kind of two other characters whose dynamics I want to explore. The first being, I think he's called Little. Is it Little Eyes or Little Face? The young child who was abandoned by his father.
I think it's Little Eyes.
So I found his character. He's, I think, supposed to illustrate a glimmer of hope amongst the society, that like an outside force can kind of break through the expectations of what someone in this community would do. And I also found him to be representative of maybe what outsiders would look at this community as, and that would be people who are discarded, because that child is quite literally discarded and left at that specific venue, I think for very good reason in this movie, because that group of people, that's what they are looked at like from the outside. And I want to get your perspective on that character and what you felt he meant to the narrative. But I also want to ask you about, I believe the character's nickname is Pimples. He is one of the boys who hangs out with El Habo. He's kind of his crony or henchman, and he is the grandson of the farmer. Um, I kind of wanted to get your take on that family as well, because they do play a very vital role in the ending of this movie. So, kind of what are your thoughts on all of those characters?
Okay, so for the first part, the first character reminded me a lot of this other movie I had seen called, and I've mentioned it to you before, it's called Pixote.
Mm-hmm.
Pixote, and it's about like a group of kind of like discarded kids. That It's Brazilian, so it is similar in a lot of ways to this movie. It's a South American, and all they do is like they're just thieves. They like go around and they rob people and places, but that's because like no one's cares about them anymore. Like they don't have any other way to live really. Like that's how they get their food. and how they like make their living. And in that movie, they end up being like sent to this like child kind of prison like area, but without getting too much into it, um, it reminded me of them, and it's I just think it's interesting because you don't see in America at least a lot of street kids. Like you don't see like very many 10-year-olds like or 11-year-olds like running around that are like you might see them, but I'm saying like you don't see any 10 or 11-year-olds standing on the side of the street like obviously they don't have parents. Like that's a very unusual thing I think in the US. But when you go to like Europe or this kind or like South America, you have like for example gypsy kids who sometimes they're just kind of left on their own, but sometimes, they're out stealing things to bring back to the group. But besides all that, I just like in terms of his role in the narrative, I would have to say I'm not 100% sure. Like I think he represents obviously a big class of like kids in Mexico City in that time because I mean like basically Pedro, the main character, is on his way to becoming one of those kids. When his mom just seems like she wants to just be rid of him for good. So I feel like that's just the next step. Like if your parents get killed, they don't want you anymore. Like it just represents maybe like you have all these kids that are these street kids in this movie and they're in a gang and they all kind of come from different backgrounds, but they're similar in that they all share like this kind of terrible experience and upbringing. But you have like the older kid, and I believe that Jabreo says at one point how he didn't really have a mom or a dad either. Maybe, and this is just me ranting and going off on my own, is that maybe like he is supposed to be a younger version of Jabro, and like you see
Mm.
him at the end he finally decides he disobeys the old man. He like uh he gets angry at him. Maybe like he's developing into that kind of figure eventually. But in terms of the second part of what you said, the whole farm part I think is really interesting. I like my first impression of it is I couldn't tell like whether those guys really were trying to do something good or if it was one of those places where they were just trying to make him feel comfortable and then it was just going to get worse and worse. I like to know what your opinion is on both these things as well because I feel like mine like I haven't put a lot of thought into the meaning of these characters and that was just kind of me like thinking off the top of my head. So what do you think?
Yeah, I liked your interpretation, especially about Little Eyes kind of potentially being an El Hebrew because I didn't see that but until you said it because I think like we said, prison can mold you into one person. You have to adapt to your surroundings and he now has a very hard life ahead of him and I do think that he could turn that way because he seems like the most moral and kind-hearted character out of everyone, maybe only second to the farmer's granddaughter. They seem like actual, and Pedro, kind of like glimmers of hopes, but the entirety of the movie kind of shows you again and again how those glimmers can kind of be snuffed out. It happens with Pedro, it happens with the farmer's granddaughter, and I think it would only be suitable if that scene was tilting its hand towards showing you that his future could easily kind of go a worse direction because of that decision. So yeah, I think the little boy who was deserted is indicative of what others look at these people as being, which, not in my words, but I think the way the movie kind of illustrates it would be like trash or discarded people, and maybe how a good soul could be turned more negative just through their environment. The farm household, I do think, is the big mystery to me, at least. I think pimples specifically is just indicative of how a lot of people will just fall in line with a leader of a society like this, and through doing so, by making concessions, can lead to worse outcomes. So they house El Hebro, and by doing so and letting him stay there kind of as a fugitive, for lack of a better term, that ultimately leads to the climactic kind of face off between Pedro and El Hebro. So I think there's a lot more to it, but the most major thing I can think of is by making concessions, and rather than standing up to the negative forces in your community, you can ultimately lead to much worse things happening down the line. So I want to get your take on that, Matt, and then after that, I want to kind of talk about the one specific surrealistic element that I could find, and then any that maybe you could point out as well.
Could you just clarify real quick what you wanted, what exactly you wanted me to comment on?
Oh, do you find any credence towards that kind of being the farm family's, I guess, what they're supposed to illustrate, I guess?
Hmm, um, I think for I wasn't really sure. Like in my head, the way I interpreted it was this is like supposed to be, and this is just from I guess I've actually like learned a lot about these like young like correction places for young people. Like even in America, they have them different camps, and this is gonna go off on a little tangent just because I've I don't have like personal experience, but I've just watched videos and stuff about these places before in documentaries. A lot of the times they like present themselves as like a like you're really gonna get your kid reformed, and there's a lot of actually like famous people and really rich people who have been sent to these camps like they were problem children, and what goes on there is usually like not good at all. It's actually like very bad, and there's a lot of like torture, and sometimes kids end up getting killed. And none of that was in this movie. That's why I said it was a little tangent. But so for me in my mind, like that represented like a glimmer, like the move from the movie's perspective, it's like a glimmer of hope because you see him wanting to go back to that place and spend those 50 pesos and bring that stuff back to the farm. And it's like you see him changing for the good. Like he has some motivation to do something. He likes working with the animals, even though there was that scene where he beat the chicken to death, and that makes you think he's really changing. And one, this is sorry, this is a little, I feel like I'm rambling a little here, but an interesting thing I thought about that part was when he's killing the chicken, it was exactly how his mom did it. But
Mm.
nevertheless, it's like he's almost trying to be reformed, but just from like personal experience, I feel like he was kind of screwed either way. Like when you see Led or Jebro, I'm just gonna say Jebro, like basically take his 50 pesos when he get out. You're like, man, he's just like has terrible luck. He's not having a good time, and it's just gonna get worse for him. But I don't know. It's hard to say like for sure what the farm part represents. But in my mind, I think that if he would have stayed there, I don't think it would have gotten any better. I think that he would have kept getting into fights with the other people with the other kids working there, and I think that the guys who run the farm who seem nice would have ended up being probably terrible people, but that's, totally out of the scope of the movie and just my opinion.
So I realized I think I got confused by one of your questions. I was referring to when I went on my whole spiel about like making concessions to El Jabro. I was talking about Pimples, his sister, and their grandfather. You know how they kind of let El Jabro stay in the loft?
Oh yeah. Okay, I was totally that's why I was so confused about your question.
Yeah, but you touched upon a really good element, which is that kind of farming correctional facility. And I did think that it does outline a potential way to try to have a positive impact on the youth that gets there through whatever means, whether it be crime or bad family units. And the one element that I think really resonated with me is that the head was trying to make impacts to the children through trust and love, which I think were two things that were greatly missing throughout the majority of the film prior to his stay there. So I did like that a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And sorry, answering your initial part. I think, that when Jabro is well, like when he's in the movie in general, he seems to always be manipulating people. It reminded me of like how a like child predator will work their way into a family
Mm.
by befriending or falling in quote unquote love with the mom of the child they're really interested in. I think he's like a snake in the sense that he can like charm people and work his way into convincing people to do things for him, and then it's all for the purpose of using them to get what he wants.
And I think that's outlined and illustrated perfectly when El Jabro is able to charm Pedro's mother. Because
Yes.
I don't know if that threw you off either, but I felt like she was going to see right through him. But I think the movie does a really good job of painting the full picture and why that relationship kind of takes hold when they go into the age that she was when she had her first kid. So, like, her life has it's been stunted in a weird way where like personal relationships are probably she's probably like less mature on an emotional attachment level than maybe someone who has dated throughout their teens and 20s before being married, as opposed to someone who is married and has their first child as young as 14.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like he's also just it's like inherent in his character the way he is throughout the whole movie. Just the fact that well, like you see it, I think for the first time, really when he's there's this part I really remember vividly where he's telling Pedro that you're not going to say what happened. I'm not going to say what happened. And he says something like, now we're like closer than ever. Like we have to be, you really have each other's backs. And that like, in a way he's like tricking him. He's much younger. Pedro's much younger than him. And he's just thinking in his head, I gotta try and scare this kid. I either gotta scare him or make him think we're really best friends so that he doesn't say anything. Where in the end, that he doesn't care about Pedro at all. He just doesn't want him to tell anyone what happened with Julian. So he's like after that moment, like the fact that he could manipulate the mom and work his way into that family, it actually just didn't surprise me. I was like, yeah, this is like par for course of this guy's like attitude and like his goal and what he does, what he is about.
Yeah, and you really outlined like how effective he can be as a manipulator. Because if you just look at that scenario on its face, He proposes like, hey, we have to leave town and we have to shut up about this, which on the face of it, it seems like, you're losing a familiar environment and then the ability to talk to people that you are very close with. But the way he kind of spins it, like you said, we have to be closer than ever. It's almost like he's gaining a more intense friendship with someone he looks up to by doing this. So it's not an absolute loss. It can actually turn into a net positive, which is like a great manipulation of a bad scenario, I found. Matt, one of the most interesting elements that I kind of wanted to discuss, because I'm still trying to figure it out myself, is there's this great dream sequence that Bunuel illustrates, which is probably the biggest depiction of surrealism in this movie. It seems very much based on the subconscious of Pedro, and it involves chickens kind of being a main element of it, and it's something that recurs throughout the movie. And I wanted to get your take on that sequence and also what the significance of chicken specifically is, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around that element.
Yeah, I thought, that's like a trademark Bunel type scene. Um, and like the way I interpreted the whole chicken thing, that scene included, is like this was like his kind of like his innocence in a way, is like what I think was represented more than anything else. And it's like, because you see him love the chickens at first, like he wants to care for them. He gets incredibly upset when his mom kills that chicken. And so the way I think of it is this is kind of like the loss of innocence for a younger person. Like if you're Pedro's age or younger, and in your household, like your parents or someone who's living with you is acting in a way where they're like when you're a kid, you have all that innocence, and you love chickens because they're cute to you and you just like love them, and that like you haven't yet developed or experienced enough life to know that like they're slaughtered, like you're eating them, you don't realize you're eating them. So to you it's like this like very innocent childlike way to like look at the world and to see like they could almost seem like they're friends to you. But then when you see like so much death and like killing, like when you see like someone kill, well, like if I would have grown up with like I love animals growing up personally, like I used to always want to work at the zoo when I was younger. If I would have seen someone like just slaughter animals all the time in front of me, like I think that would have just like destroyed that whole innocence aspect for me. Like I would have no longer cared about watching an animal get killed. Like it still bothers me because it's that whole like desensitization. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. Like you're just you when you experience that kind of thing young, or that extreme violence, it just changes you. And that's shown when he kills that chicken at the farm.
I agree, and especially after your explanation, and that wasn't something that initially clicked with me. It actually was, you saying it just now, but that does make an awful lot of sense, I think. And I also think there's a twofold kind of symbolism to it, where I feel like the chicken is also representative of like what role this community plays societally. And obviously the term lambs to the slaughter is used more prevalently, but I also think that it can almost work very well with chickens too, because like you said, they're often slaughtered and are kind of there's very little value actually placed on them aside from what they can bring to you, like to eat. So like I feel like it kind of works on that level too, where it's like they can be discarded, they can be treated with great acts of violence if it benefits you, but beyond that, the chicken and this kind of small community are oftentimes just not greatly valued by others.
Yeah, yeah, it's I feel like, back then especially they wouldn't have even really considered that type of violence to have such a big impact on a young person. But now today we kind of have started to figure out how, when people see those kinds of things or they feel abandoned or see a lot of violence at a young age, it like really impacts you when you're older. You like don't really forget that kind of thing and it can turn you into a different person.
Yeah, and I also think that Pedro's violent outburst, just kind of emboldening your point. I mean, it is something psychologically. I think it's the maybe it's the dark triad, or there are kind of three criteria that are oftentimes times met with violent offenders in their past. One being bedwetting, another being infatuation with fire or pyrotechnics, and the third being violence against animals. So I think a very clear depiction of Pedro's psyche being broken from the situation in which he has been put into so far. And it shows how this negativity has caught up with him. So I think a loss of innocence is clearly, being very strongly kind of nodded to by the director, with that being included.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I really like this movie, Matt. I want to ask you two questions. First of all, is there any other kind of symbolism you picked up on? And if not, is there anything additionally that you would like to talk about with The Young and the Damned?
No, I think we talked about everything. I just wanted to make sure, we had talked about the chicken thing, the farm part, like the psyche of Jibro, and as well as the psyche and the situation of the mom. I think those were like to me the things that stuck out the most in terms of like things to discuss about this movie. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this movie. This to me feels like the movie that you see and it belongs in like top 250 movies of all time, something like that. And you realize this is the type of movie that probably will never or arguably should never leave a list like that. And yeah, I rated this movie a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know if you asked me about ratings, but I just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah, so I'm right with you. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I thought it was great, and I think it gives a complete picture of what the narrative was going for. The next movie that we watched is That Obscure Object of Desire. Now, this one is definitely further on the spectrum as far as like artistic and creative decisions being made. It is the story of an older gentleman who arrives home and then sets out to leave on a train. And as he boards, he pours a bucket of water on a young woman. And in his train car, divulges the story of why he did so. And basically, picking up from there, Matt, this had a lot of wild and wacky elements to it that I really enjoyed. How did you feel about a lot of the kind of unique decisions that Bunuel used in this movie?
I think like those decisions kind of like go to his whole like surrealist way of making movies. And I thought, no, this was a movie that when I started it, I didn't really remember it. Like I've seen this movie before, but the only thing I really remembered was the very end. Which obviously the end is pretty like shocking. Um, but as it was going on, I was like, why? It was like that other movie we watched. It's blanking on me, but like I for somehow I didn't remember it, and so it was kind of like a new viewing for me. And as it kind of went through, I was just very surprised by a lot of things. I forgot about the whole double actress thing,
Mm-hmm.
how there's two different actresses. I was trying to figure out the whole time, like, what is the meaning of this? And I think it may have just been like a technical thing. Um, but yeah, so many things about this movie that you can really like dive into and talk about. But like for what I got out of it the most, I think it really is just a movie about like how women say they're treated or they feel like objects. I think this is like a movie about that, basically.
Yeah, so the title, from my whole understanding and reading others' interpretations of this, is kind of paramount to understanding what Bunuel was trying to do. So I just want to like preface a lot of what I'm going to say with that, because the title is something that just keep in mind through your interpretations of this if you're watching this video, because I find that to be important and it all ties back to that. I mean, ultimately what Bunuel is trying to illustrate is the obscure object of desire. Something I'll say just out the get go, I think it took me an embarrassingly long time to finally nail down that there was two actresses playing the lead actress, or the lead female character, because you know like when he dumped the water on the woman in the train, you don't see her like quite enough to like have a fully fledged like picture of what the woman looks like. So when you see someone who looks slightly different, you just I chalked it up to, okay, maybe it's just like her makeup's different, so she looks like that. And then, she had the one actress had her hair up, so she looked similar to the other actress, but something felt very off about that. And then eventually it becomes very obvious that these are two different women. And I've heard interpretations on why that's done, but I just wanted to get that out there. Like, I have never seen in like a major movie that ever been done. And towards the end, it becomes so obvious that I have to think that it was done purposefully, because it is like they look so different, and they're interspliced like in scenes where they'll walk out of the room and then the other actress will be the actress that comes into the room seconds later. It feels very, very calculated from that perspective.
Yeah, yeah, that was so I kind of had the same like reaction you did, even though this was the second time for me. Somehow that was something I didn't remember. But I was watching it and like she had her hair up and I was like, maybe it's like her makeup, the way she did
Mm-hmm.
her makeup is different. And because the other actress looked like maybe she didn't have any makeup on. But then when her hair was no longer up, I was like, about halfway through the movie, I started like, okay, I'm really gonna pay attention to what this actress looks like, and then the scene where I don't think it's her, I'm gonna like confirm to myself that like there's no way this is the same person. And then after I did that, I started like, and this is just me being over analytical, but I was like starting to think, okay, like does one actress represent like scenes when certain things are going on, like when he's having a good time with her, she's playing the part, and when like they're fighting, it's the other actress. But then I thought, no, that's not it. And my like final conclusion if you want to say, you know, he did this actors exchange to help, like, say the message of the movie, um, I would say maybe it's because it's trying to show that he didn't even notice they were two different. Actually, you know, they were two different people, and like, cause I thought the whole time I was like, they're tricking him. Like, there's this, you know, they're obviously they're thieves. I think they're supposed to be a part of that terrorist group, and so maybe it's this huge plot, you know, to steal money from him, and they're just exchanging themselves out, um to please him, and he doesn't even notice they're different people because he's so, you know, caught up in wanting to have sex, basically. um this so that was my like ending conclusion. What did you think?
So I think everything you said are thoughts that I also had watching the movie as well. And I think that there is, I think there's weight to that. I do think he's blinded in his actions, and also like I think it is to show that his view of her, it's like it's not an actual person. It's like she's representative of something more. It's like the ultimate object of desire. Like he just wants to have sex with her. So his actual like mental image of her isn't actually as crystal clear as you would think, to your point. I think that is kind of something that's supposed to be defined by the change of actress. And I also think, because I had the very same feeling you did, because there were scenes where they seemingly got along very well, and then obviously there was friction between the two. So I was trying to notice as well, like, was it the one actress, you know, whenever they were fighting, and then I kind of found that both of them had like in equal parts like actual connective moments, and then more aggressive kind of conflicting moments. So I think rather than one representing the love and care aspect and one representing like the friction aspect, I think the fact that there is two actresses, it's to show the kind of duality of that character, and that there's the loving part of their relationship and the kind of more conflictual aspect of their relationship. So while one actress didn't appear only during those scenes, the split of two actresses being used is to show that this kind of desire based relationship, there are two facets to it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And it's kind of like, you know, I think it's interesting that like in one of the actresses is wearing a like chastity belt, and then in another, the other one at one point is like a stripper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, maybe like he's trying to say it doesn't really matter if like if she's extremely sexually active or if she's like never been sexually active. He feels the same exact way because like you're right, it's like from the jump he's, well, like he's being really creepy. Like right when she's like the maid and he just is like all over her, and it's like he's first met her. You kind of are like, okay, this guy's like creepy. Like it's pretty obvious. Like all he wants is, you know, to have sex with her, and then that just kind of goes on and on. It's like she's the ultimate like tease in his mind. Like she's teasing him so much, and he just like he can't take it, and but you also never see him care about anything except that. Like he never really gets to know her. They never really have any sort of deep conversations. Like all their conversations with both actresses, for the most part, revolve around him trying to get her into bed, basically.
Yeah. And what you just said, there's so much to unpack with that. I I want to preface this question with something that I want to keep in mind for discussion afterwards, and that being something that I noticed was as his, I guess, mental image of the woman he desired changed to where he believed her to be this chastitied virgin woman to being more promiscuous and actually having slept with others and being a stripper. His violent impulses also kind of elevate with that. So as his image of her purity is at an all-time high, he is very nonviolent, and as the two kind of flip as both, as he sees her to be more promiscuous. But before we kind of dive into that, I want to ask kind of a simple question because it was something that came up to me while watching this. Is, I guess, who do you dislike more? Because I think there's a lot of elements to dislike about both characters. Did you dislike the kind of older, creepy man who is trying to be manipulative in his own way, or the woman who is clearly using the older man?
At first I definitely disliked the man more, but for some reason, like, I think it was just seeing I think it's just like when you see someone get manipulated like for like an hour and a half, you start to feel bad for them. And so at
Mm-hmm.
the end, I was first I was like, "Oh my gosh, just like he needs to like get over it or she just needs to like take his money and like leave already. Like make it stop." So like I sort of started supporting him at the end. I was like not supporting, but I felt bad for him.
Yeah, the scene that really solidified the flip from disliking the man more was the cruelty when after he gave her the deed to the house, she had sex with her one friend in front of him.
Hmm.
I just thought that to be
Yeah.
like such a cruel action to take and so over the top of what needed to be done, that I really started to dislike her after that. I just thought that was like a step too far. And I guess a follow up question to that, she kind of comes up with or says that that was simulated and was to try to see or test his love. Do you buy that story, or do you think she thought I can no longer manipulate him if he thinks this to be the truth, so I have to come up with kind of a story to make that seem like it wasn't real? What was your thoughts? Because I think either one kind of works for the narrative of, well, I think they both work, but in different ways towards what the narrative's going for. So what was your kind of interpretation of that?
Yeah, for me at that point, I didn't believe her at all. I thought what I thought was that guy actually was because she mentions he also doesn't like women, like he's gay.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought in my mind, okay, that's probably true. But so I like my conclusion was basically that she was messing with him, like just trying to make him angry. And so then I think, why is she doing that? Um, and I can't figure out what the answer is. To me it just goes back to she's pushing him as far as she can. Is it that scene where she kind of alludes to how he just thinks of her as an object? I don't know if maybe she's trying to prove a point, but I think that after that, it's gone a little too far. But I just don't understand again why she returns the next day and she's like, I wanted to make sure you didn't like kill yourself. And then he starts like beating the shit out of her.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like for some reason she likes to mess with him. I don't know, and I don't know why.
Yeah, I think if you're to look at it from a very realistic standpoint, the story just seems way too far fetched to actually believe. But in this kind of surrealist reality, that Bunuel creates with this, I think it lends itself more towards what Bunuel is trying to depict, that it actually was just a ruse that the woman created. Because I think Bunuel does a tremendous job of kind of unpacking and telling this story that in a really weird way shows the male psyche quite well, and like through desire, literally. I think it gives like a very full picture of the male psyche when it comes to desire in all aspects, and how when we you desire things that you can't get. And I think the woman puts it perfectly, that once you get the thing you desire, your relationship with that forever changes, where you these feelings that you think are love kind of change forever once you get that thing, once the chase is over. And it's not necessarily a negative thing, but the relationship changes nonetheless.
Exactly. I think like what you just said, in my opinion, is like if you could say what's the point of this movie or what's it trying to say, I think that's exactly what it's trying to say. Because like you go through the movie and as like it goes along, the more he doesn't get it what he wants with her, like the angrier he gets, the more he wants it. It's like she's fishing him in and like and she can just keep rejecting his advances, and every time she does that, like uh, she has more and more control over him because of the fact that he wants it more and more because like she rejects it. And I think of like you hear this all the time like about dating and hooking up with people, how like when you sleep with someone, that it changes the dynamic of the relationship completely. And that's why I think a lot of people are hesitant, and it's mostly women that are hesitant to have sex so early on, because there are so many guys that are similar to the character here, where that seems to be all they really want. Like they don't really care about who the girl is as a person. It's just like they want that goal. They want to achieve that desire that they have. And then after they achieve it, it's like, okay, task complete. I've got what I wanted. I don't care about you as much anymore. Like I bet he wouldn't have ever given her the deed to the house if she would have previously slept with him.
Yeah, exactly. And something that I think is like a really good point to kind of bring up is that despite their relationship almost completely revolving around sex that never occurs, it seems like the man and the woman, or at least the man, never really begins to actually understand who the woman is. Which I find to be really funny, because they have this long relationship that is entirely based around the chase and nothing else. They really he gets to know her slightly whenever she dances with him, but that quickly kind of just devolves into her teasing him again. And it's like he can never kind of turn his brain off from that. It's like he's just trying to get her to break her will towards that, and she is just trying to remain intact, I guess.
Yeah, I think when I think about what people would term as like the chase, or guys chasing girls, and some people will say like, oh, well, this guy, he's like really a chaser or a hunter, and then other guys, they might not be as aggressive and they want more people, let people come to them. I think like this movie shows that whole like chase like concept more better than any other film does. Because it's like part of the surrealism is in the fact that the relation like for me is that like the relationship is not realistic. Like you never, like you were just saying, like you never really learn about her. Like you never learn like, well, like simple things like where she's from or what she's even doing in these towns. It's like you think she's part of this terrorist organization, which I know I'm sure is something we're going to talk about. Also didn't really understand that part. But you know, you kind of figure, okay, maybe she's like part of this terrorist organization, but like besides that, like it's just him like trying to figure out different ways to get her into his bed. And that's like, and that's it. And it's like the fact that the relationship is so unrealistic and that's like all you see out of it, it like emphasizes that whole chase aspect to where like all the relationship really is in the end is the chase, is that like push and pull people have, you know, in most relationships, like that push and pull exists before the two people ever have sex, really, you know, because someone is wanting it more than the other person's kind of, you know, backing off a little, like, oh, you know, I don't want to do it right now. And it's and I think it ultimately goes back to like this like human thing that like we want what we can't have,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, we want to chase what we can't have. And it's as if she, you know, like we've already kind of said this in a different way, but like she isn't really a person. She's reduced to that chase for him.
Yeah, and like you said, like how she's not really a person. I think that is like how Bunel's trying to break down the psychopathy of desire when it comes to, you know, sexuality within men. That there is a bit of objectification to that. And that's not to say that all men objectify women, but when you're purely motivated by desire, that is an innate aspect that comes with that, I think. And I do find that to be really interesting, and I think Bunel kind of hit the nail on the head when it came to that. I want to kind of go into the terrorist aspect because that was the kind of tipping point that made me. Oh, before I get to that, I want to say and kind of get your opinion. I think this movie does a great job of showing, and there might be a better term for this, but that the chase can in some ways be intoxicating in and of itself. And do you think that was something that was trying to be depicted by this movie?
Absolutely, because you know, I think you see it more than anything else in the attitude and the way the main character is acting. Like it's like the fact that he hasn't got what he wants, and like the chase is becoming, it's like evolving where it's becoming crazy for him because it's, he's like, why hasn't, you know, she slept with me yet? It's been so long, I've done all these things for her, and like she hasn't given him what he really wants in exchange, you know, even if he doesn't, you know, he doesn't deserve it, but he thinks, see, like change his personality. Like you would have, like he's so violent at the end. Like I thought possibly he was gonna kill her or something. So yeah, I think it really could take you over and change you as a person. And you know, we didn't really get to see what he was like before, but I think just that evolution we see into him as being a violent person, it's almost like he's got like crazy look in his eyes when he's looking at her because like he because he wants it so bad.
Yeah, I mean, he seems like a man possessed, honestly, and his
Hmm.
violence just continues to escalate.
Yeah, yeah.
So the terrorist aspect, something that you brought up earlier, as I was saying, this was the one aspect that I had to look deeper into after finishing the movie, because it's ever present. It continues to pop up time and time again, and it's not even something that you can really even dismiss, because it's not even done. It's done subtly, but to a point that it sticks with you after the movie, at least in my viewing. And it was something that I really wanted to crack the code on. And do you have any theories of your own before I kind of go into what I kind of read as others' interpretations of it?
My only thought was maybe there was a bunch of bombings and terrorist activity in Spain in the 70s, but besides that, I have no clue.
So that's a good like hypothesis. What I heard from others, and I do think it aligns quite well, is that as the man is being like frustrated from like the pure definition of frustration and trying to get something and not being able to achieve it, he becomes more agitated, more angry, and more violent. And apparently, the terrorist attacks and the escalation of that is to kind of illustrate the rising tensions and the aggressiveness escalating as the man's violence does as well. And apparently, all of this is to kind of complete the human psyche, or not human, I guess male psyche specifically, when it comes to desire. In that, when we don't get it, it can often frustrate us and make us angry. But also, I think Bunuel is trying to kind of inject some like very deep like psychiatrist type, like I'm talking the Jungs of the world and the Freuds of the world, that there is, hypothetically, some male attractiveness to being physically violent with women. So all of that is supposed to kind of create this stew that's being played out in the real world around him.
That's interesting. Yeah, I did not think of that. But I can see that. I can see it. I'm not like sure exactly what like I would comment on about that. I the only part that would confuse me is why what do you think the point of like when they rob him with a knife for 500 euros and then you kind of realize that they're connected to her because she has the money and then he's like, "Oh no, like I don't need it back. It's okay." Do you have a theory on the whole like the kind of aspect of the movie where they're like seen like a terrorist gang?
Yeah, so like her connection to it is confusing. And I only wonder if like her connection is to show like a soft escalation, like it where it starts out being relatively harmless and then it just keeps getting worse and worse. And I think that is true, but also my memory isn't like serving me correctly, because I do remember at one point like an airliner goes down in a newspaper he's reading, and I think that's before
Mhm.
he ever gets physically violent with her, but maybe that's just to depict how angry he's getting at that point in the movie. I do think it is an interesting, like, the psychiatric discussion, or not psychiatric, the I'm blanking on the word. You would study it in school if you were like studying the mind. It's psychology. Do you think
Hmm.
there is anything innately within man that there is, and I'm not talking on like a personal experience, because I think that most people on a personal level wouldn't find this to be true, but I do think that it has been theorized, and there does seem like there could be credence to the fact that there is a sort of like sick attraction when it comes to violence and sex on the male side specifically.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have never understood why people, because I'm just like don't like violence in general. Like in real life, I've never been a very violent person, but it's very widespread and like popular for people to enjoy like BDSM and like rape fantasies even.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of pornography that a lot of guys watch that it's like violent stuff. Like people there's definitely a connection between violence and sex, and that goes I think it's definitely more focused on the male psyche, but I think it goes for both men and women. I mean, a lot of women
Mm.
like obviously they don't want to be really harmed like we're like really badly during sex, but a lot of like things like being tied up or like getting choked a little bit, like all those things are popular, like both male and females like that. So yeah, I think there is like this, and it's something like I said, like I've never really been able to understand the connection because violence turns me off in any way, like completely. But it seems to be something that is like you're like psychologically there's some connection there. And I don't really know how to I don't really like personally know why that is at all. Like I can't even really think of a reason why they would be connected, but they definitely are.
Do you think that it stems from like the cavemen times? You know how oftentimes people say, "Oh, that's like the lizard brain or the lizard part of our brain where it's like a deep-seated evolutionary aspect." Do you think it stems from that where aggressive, violent men were more likely to reproduce, and that's like hardwired into a lot of male brains when it comes to that?
Um, I think like you would probably get like in my mind the two perspectives would be that perspective. Maybe like that'd be more like an evolutionary biology type thing, like we've evolved in a certain way because different things have happened. And then I think the other side might be like if you're socializing and or it would be like the whole socialization thing, like where you grow up learning that violence is connected to sex and somehow that turns you on. But like to me that's such like a hard thing to figure out. I really don't I don't know what it is at all, honestly. What do you think?
Well, I think it's something that is still like trying to be figured out fully, because you often see in serial killers it becomes something inexorably linked, and that
Mhm.
ends up becoming their the big problem for them, is that they find out that this is something they really really like, whether it's killing them during the act or well, yeah, killing them during the act would be the one that is, the most definitive version of sex and violence being taken to the ultimate extreme. And generally, the people who kill after the act, it's a way to maybe cover up what they're doing. It's something that they find shameful. But for the people who do it during the act, like Ted Bundy is one of the biggest examples I could think of, specifically when he went to Florida State. I mean, we know that he went into four different girls' rooms and brutally killed three of them, and completely altered the life of one other, because that was how he was achieving sexual gratification. And they've tried to study his childhood and how did those wires get crossed. And it almost seems like perhaps the timing of when those kind of aspects of your lives can start to form in your brain might be similarly timed. So, where you begin to express aggression as a child, and when you begin to find, like, just relationships in general or actual attraction, maybe that, there's just something definitively that it links from. But, psychologists can't even really determine that themselves. So I would have to think, though, like the caveman theory that I've thought to be true, you would think that to be much more prevalent, where the extreme would happen more frequently than what we found in modern times, I guess, if that was definitively true. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. That's why I think like it can't be explained maybe so easily. Like you kind of like what you were just saying, like one way or the other. I think maybe my best guess would be that it's a mix of both because like you see like people like Ted Bundy or like people that are like psychopaths or they're determined to be, psychopathic and they have a lot of the times they'll have something actually different in their brain. Like their frontal cortex will be different
Mm-hmm.
than other people brain scans, and that's a lot because that like I don't think this is something that they don't know like scientifically neither way has been proven, but I think that they think you can be born or like kind of like that already, or you can kind of develop into that through your upbringing. And I've actually also heard of cases where people end up turning into like kind of psychopathic because of a head injury.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because your frontal or your prefrontal cortex is damaged. Well, that's like the area of your brain that like processes things like empathy and fear. And so if you take empathy and fear out of people, it's going to change like any person if they're not scared of anything or if they can't feel bad for other people, like it's not literally impossible for them. Stuff like that is is like it comes into play. And then you also have the other kind of side where like okay, where they raised in a bad family, and then you have examples of people who were like I'm pretty sure Ted Bundy wasn't raised poorly, like like he had a fine upbringing as far as I know. But then you see other people who they probably could have been completely normal people or they were normal people, but it was like the way they were raised just like turned them into this other person that they never and had it weren't be for like all this abuse and stuff they suffered. So I really think it's like this complicated mix of all these factors that like so it's all very individualistic. Like I don't think you can say generally like, oh, if this one thing happened to this person, they're for sure gonna end up this way. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just like all these factors just happen to come together a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. And the only like case study that I could dissect is Bundy, just because it's one that I'm like very very familiar with. But to your point, much like, I mean, there is so many different aspects in a case by case basis. Everything changes. Like someone's father could be an alcoholic, and the son could either turn into an alcoholic themselves, or maybe there'll be someone who never touches it. So it's like a one for
Mhm.
one reaction. You can't even, that's not even predictive really. But the two things that I do know, or at least would theorize would have great impact on him, is the change in relationship with his mother, or the woman he thought to be his mother, who was actually his grandmother. And apparently, from people who spoke to him, this was the revelation when they told him that she was not indeed his mother, had a great impact on him. And I do think that, if you do study Freud, and how he believes men view their mother growing up, you could maybe think that a change in that relationship towards that figure being someone you greatly dislike, have aggressive feelings towards because of that, and having hate towards someone that you initially love more than any woman in your life could maybe be a good explanation towards why sex and violence has been something that gets gravely twisted in his point. And then the second kind of big factor in his life is apparently the first girlfriend that he really, really loved breaking up with him. And you find that a lot of his victims have a very similar look to his first girlfriend. You know, they had darker hair, a part down the middle, and nearly all of his victims had this same look. And you have to think, you know, a jilted lover, having someone that you've had intimate feelings with, and to then kind of have this growing disdain could easily kind of conjoin those two aspects of your brain. And I find that to be kind of telling, or something that can also kind of transfer over to this movie with that obscure object of desire, someone who he desires unlike anything else, someone that he has grown to have these very, very strong feelings towards, and then she kind of wrongs him in a way. It then kind of mixes those two in his mind, where he's expressing his feelings towards her with violence rather than what you would normally associate with someone you love.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to explain it, you know, like when like kind of like the confusing or like the intertwining of like sexual thoughts and violent thoughts, it kind of all becomes like more together in the in some people like somehow. I think that the way this movie shows that is good because it's like you see like when he starts hitting her, it's kind of like in a way he's being pushed to his limit. That's at least what I felt, is that he seems like he was like pushed to his absolute limit. But then you also think like, has he gotten this way with other people? Like what if he was in a normal relationship and he was like used to having sex with someone, and then like one night they were like, oh, I don't want to tonight, and he was like, well, like I have to. It's like this like burning thing inside of him that he's gonna be violent because of that. I don't know. It's very conceptual, and I think it's hard to explain, you know, how these things come together exactly, because it's also very individualistic for every person.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with that. And it also feels like, um, and in saying this, I'm not saying like that I approve of this action, and that it was the only way for him to achieve this. Because I think, like in a healthy relationship, any person thinking logically would never take it to that extreme, and would probably just not be with the woman in this story. But for him, I think he had put himself in a situation where this was the only way that he could express himself. And obviously, he's angry and all of that, and I find that all to be true as well. But because they don't have the sexual aspect of their relationship, the violent aspect almost, it kind of covers that aspect. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
So that this is the way that he express himself in that area, rather than what would normally be done in a relationship.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I you know, this movie is just very, it's very interpretive, you know, like all these things Bunuel could have not meant to do any of this at all. But I think that's what makes the movie so good. Just because like we can talk about this and like have these thoughts afterwards. uh, not knowing whether he intended that to be the message or not.
Exactly. And going back to our discussion last week, I think what we're doing here in the interpretative nature of this movie is kind of the genius and the richness that art house movies have as a whole when done and executed well, right? But like this is the not the cherry on top. It's like that's what these types of movies are all about, really. Like that is the enriching part of the experience, I think, at least.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. I think that like this is a perfect example of like an art house movie and like the type of things or the like some problems they like raise are usually different than other movies and they're usually very interpretive.
Matt, is there any additional aspects that you want to talk about or cover for that obscure object of desire?
I just had one quick question, and I wanted to know what you thought about this. What is he looking at the end before, the bomb goes off at the very end of the movie? What is that he's like staring at? Is that what she was wearing?
Ah, okay. Yeah, I remembered questioning that too. I thought I don't know if she wore that, and I can't remember. I was trying to put my finger on why the woman sewing was so like mesmerizing towards him. And I just thought it to be maybe like him remembering maybe his mother, because the woman sewing did have a very motherly look to her, and maybe like a longing for a time before like the relationships were with others were based upon desire. That was kind of what I got from it. But if I can't remember if she wore that. If she did wear that, that could very likely be it. But I was trying to put my finger on that as well. And also the explosion, I didn't know whether that was supposed to be like the mall exploding or just showing like, oh, they're in another fight and the chaos in this area continues. You know what I mean? So what did you think? And if it was her, whatever, like, what I don't even know what that thing would be called. What did you think that was representative of? I guess if that was it.
Yeah, I have no clue. I thought it looked like some kind of bridal wedding type thing, but the reason I thought it might have been hers
Oh,
is it had like blood on it. That's the only
oh,
reason. But yeah, I have no idea besides that.
yeah. I don't. Well, that brings up like two kind of different things. I mean, if it is a bridal thing, that would make sense because I don't know if you remember his conversation with his friend that he said, the only thing I have in my back pocket is marriage. Like if I give that away, I have no leverage. I don't
Mm.
know if you remember that conversation, but
Yeah, I
maybe
do.
maybe it was like an epiphany that he's like, oh well, maybe I could propose to her and then we can finally have sex. I don't know. It could be that. It could be the mother thing. I think that's maybe a looser one that just kind of was the first thing that came to my head. But if it was the blood, I don't know. Maybe he was just excited by like thinking of the violence he had done to her and how those two wires had kind of crossed. I think all three are kind of valid though.
Yeah, like we were just saying, I think there is not really a right answer, which is like part of the reason this movie is so interesting.
Did you think the explosion happened there, or what did you think of the explosion at the very end?
Yeah, I didn't know. Like that was I have no idea. Like I thought one of them set a bomb up or something to blow up as they were walking away, but it really I don't know. I feel like if I express an opinion, I'm gonna immediately be like, I don't think that's right.
Same here. Yeah. I did find it to be very, very interesting as a whole. And I really love that there's so many little tiny elements that can be kind of dissected and try to figure out. I want to ask you, Matt, what did you rate this movie?
Uh, I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5. I think uh it would be closer between like a 4 and a 4.5 for me. It's not close to being like a 5-star movie, but I really enjoyed this one.
I gave this one a 4 out of 5 as well, though I do feel strongly. I felt this way after watching them, and now after having talked them through with you. I definitely have a preference of that obscure object of desire over The Young and the Damned. While I think they're both great, obviously, love them both. But I do give slight preference to this, and I think if you want to watch Bunuel, I guess this is a question to throw your way. I would imagine this movie, That Obscure Object of Desire, is probably closer to what his aura is as a director and a storyteller.
Absolutely. Like if this movie is or Obscure Object is similar to like Discreet Charm that I was talking about earlier, Belle de Jour, The Exterminating Angel. I would say like another movie like if you enjoy the Obscure Object of Desire, like there's a whole three. I actually own it. It's like a Criterion set with The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, That Obscure Object of Desire, and The Phantom of Liberty are the three movies in the set. I think those, while they're not like that related, I think they all kind of have a very similar feel to them. So I think, if you enjoyed this, I think you'll like any of those other two movies.
I definitely I want to check those out in the future because I think I became a fan of Bunuel after watching these two. Matt, thank you for your recommendation. And thank you for talking to me about these movies because this was really really fun, and like I was saying, I think the rewarding aspect of films like this are getting to discuss them with others. So it was really cool to get to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a really good director that I had kind of forgotten a little bit about before last week. So I'm really glad we did an episode on him.
I agree, and people watching this definitely check Bunuel out. And thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, and we will catch y'all on the flippity floop. Bye, y'all.